Between Dungeon Master tips and world-building ideas, today's episode is packed.
Welcome to Dicegeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is Dicegeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I really hope you know who I am by now. I am the Random Tables guy. I create random tables to help game masters run better sessions at the table. You can find them at Dicegeeks.com, Amazon.com, or DriveThruRPG.com. And if you want to, you can just type in the Book of Random Tables in Google and you will find it. I have a whole series of those books, ranging from fantasy to cyberpunk to science fiction and more. You know, I just wanted to take a second really quick and talk about the podcast a little bit. I have been doing this podcast now since September 2019. I really enjoy it. I love talking to all of the people that I get to talk to, some phenomenal game designers, amazing creatives, and I love it. However, if you want me to keep making this show, I need some help, guys. I need some ratings, reviews, and some subscribers in Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Stitcher, and other platforms where you might be listening to this podcast. Those things just help the show out a ton, and I really need your help. Like I said, if I'm going to keep making this podcast, I need your support. Some of those things are just pressing a button. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, think about giving it a review, a rating, or subscribing to it. I would really appreciate it. Also, to keep making this show, I really need your help on Patreon. I know times can be tough out there, but if you are in a position to support the show financially, I would greatly appreciate it. You can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show. That would mean the world to me, and any support I receive there will just go right back into making this the best podcast that I can. Okay, guys, enough of all that. Here's the interview for today. My guest today is a longtime dungeon master, as well as the creator behind Icarus Games, Anto Cerrato. Anto, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, you're quite welcome. How were you first introduced to Dungeons and Dragons?
I believe it was during 3rd edition, not 3.5, but the OG 3rd edition via the starter set, the red box, as it would have been at the time. I was at a friend's house doing some wargaming because I got into tabletop gaming through wargaming at first, and there was just this box on the shelf and they pulled it out. I believe it was their dad's, and they're like, hey, we should play this. And that's how I very first dipped my toe into the world of kind of the RPG side of tabletop games.
I see. So what drew you to, let's start with wargaming. What drew you to that first?
That would be about 2001-ish. I was in a local shop and I saw a magazine with a Lord of the Rings image on the cover. The Fellowship of the Ring had recently come out in cinemas, and I was obsessed with the films. They're still some of my favorite films to this day. And I saw this magazine with the Moria goblins on the cover, and I went over and it had a little sprue of miniatures on it. It was the Lord of the Rings games from Games Workshop. And I picked it up, and it started a lifelong obsession with painting miniatures, and it grew from there and eventually evolved.
And then when you were introduced to tabletop role-playing games, that just kind of went right along with your wargaming kind of obsession already?
Yeah, I've always been super interested in the narrative side of tabletop games. When I used to play just war games, I was always more interested in the kind of story-based battles that you could fight out. So it made a lot of sense when I kind of graduated into RPGs. That kind of narrative focus really appealed to me.
I think that happens to a lot of people. They realize that you can actually then kind of tell a story about your little miniature there instead of just having a piece on a board.
Exactly. Kind of codifying the story rather than just being all up in my head. Now there is actually a story and we're playing through the story rather than it just being something that exists to go alongside the dice rolls.
Yeah. Now, did you stay with Dungeons and Dragons for a while, or did you branch out into other tabletop RPGs?
So when I very first got started, we picked up the red box and played for a couple of evenings, but we didn't really adopt tabletop RPGs right away. We kind of stuck to playing war games for many years. And then a few years later, kind of at the end of our school years, we started dabbling a little bit more with RPGs, but it was years and years of kind of false starts and trying to get campaigns up and running and scheduling falling through and all of that kind of tale as old as time stuff. It wasn't really until I took over the mantle of Dungeon Master and started saying, right, I want to put a game together. Do you want to play? That we started having kind of long-term games. Everything before that had been little stops and starts, a game of D&D here, a session of Pathfinder there.
Yeah, and that is as you mentioned, it's sadly an all too common tale for some people. That you, it does seem to take a while to get some of that going sometimes. But once you kind of took over, I guess you really took to the Dungeon Master side.
Yeah, well, in the run-up to me kind of approaching my friend group and saying, look, I want to do this, I'd been consuming some kind of Dungeons and Dragons media. I'd been watching the Acquisitions Incorporated games, the PAX Live games, and I adored them and wanted kind of that long-term game experience. So when I approached my friends and said, look, I want to do this, I did it by saying, I want to run a long-term game. I'm going to be running it on this day, and I plan on running it indefinitely. And then once I started, we've been playing every week ever since.
Oh, wow. Now that is an accomplishment. That's been a number of years then, right?
Yeah, we're going on 3-4 years of the same group now. Nice. And that comes mainly down to kind of a near dictator-like stance of, we are playing on this day, and so long as one of you turns up, I will run a game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sadly, it took me a while to learn that. It was just like, hey, if one person comes, we're running.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Now, have you moved on to 5e, or do you still play one of the older editions?
We started playing 5e earlier this year. We played Pathfinder for 2 or 3 years, a level 3 through 20 campaign in Pathfinder. And once I'd run level 20 of Pathfinder, I couldn't bear to start again. It was the complexity and just everything that was going on. I was like, I need a palate cleanser after this. So we picked up 5e and started playing through that, which is what we're playing weekly now.
I know what you're talking about on Pathfinder, but
I mean, I love it. Lots of cherished memories, but also so much mental overhead as the Dungeon Master to try and keep track of everything.
Yeah. We kind of, me and my group kind of had a false start with Pathfinder. We started and using Pathfinder, and then it was just, after a few sessions, it was just like, why don't we try Dungeons and Dragons 5e?
Yeah. It's not for everyone, that kind of added layer of complexity to it. It's not super complex, but it isn't for everyone. But I enjoy it for what it is, but I was in no rush to be running another campaign so soon after handling a bunch of level 20 characters.
You said you started running games, but you've also started creating content, giving out Dungeon Master advice. Isn't that right?
I have indeed. It kind of became inevitable when I took over the DM mantle for the group, that it becomes kind of all-consuming when you're a DM and you have to build the world and run the games. So why not start making advice for other people as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, let's kind of get into, now just for me to give you a little background. I played Dungeons and Dragons once when I was 9, and then the next day I ran my mom through a dungeon.
Nice.
So I have been running games since I was 9, not only Dungeons and Dragons, but some other games as well. So yeah, let's just dive into some Dungeon Master advice, because I know a lot of people who are listening want to up their games, as it were, and we can always learn a lot of things. Maybe let's just start off. What do you consider like one of the most important things? And we'll start there.
Probably it would be the simple advice of always keep a list of names within hand's reach. Just no matter where you are in the world, keep a list of names on you. If you're out and about in the middle of nowhere, just a pocketbook with names in it, because you never know when you're going to need it as a dungeon master.
Yeah, that and sadly, again, well, I always say this, but it always took me a long time to learn some of these things. And after sessions and campaigns of having, every NPC named Bob or or something like that, it finally dawned on me that I could have a list of names near me, and I could just pick one of those or roll random on a random table of names.
Yeah. One thing that I have found really useful lately is I made kind of an Mpc Generator Table for myself. It's a D20 table with several columns, and it gives me options for kind of race, class, a motivation, a character trait or quirk, something physical about them. And then if I need an NPC on the fly, I just roll a handful of D20s, and I end up with something interesting as a result. And because it includes a motivation and kind of a fear, it gives me a really good starting point for a personality for a character, because I know what they want and I know what they're afraid of, and I can just improvise the rest.
Oh, that's nice. And I know in some of my books that I've released, I always try to include a list of names and at least some professions or something like that for different NPCs.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's, I don't know. I guess we all kind of have this similar experience, and you'll probably agree. It's just your party walks into like the general store, and all they're going to do is buy something really quick, and you're like, I don't even want to role play this out, so just go ahead and buy something.
Yeah,
there's like a clerk here or something. There's always a player who's like, what's his name?
Yeah.
Who's the girl sweeping the floor? What are their names? Where do they come from? And you're just like, oh my goodness.
I want to walk into this town and find the 7th person I meet and ask them what their name is.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is some really good advice. And like I said, it is one of those pieces of advice that it's deceptively simple or trivial sounding, but oh my goodness, right? Like just
it will take you far.
Yes.
Having just a handful of names and kind of a handful of even just motivations would take you a lot farther than you might think, and eventually you kind of lean into the lack of prep that you need once you've got this kind of bedrock ready to improvise on, and you'll come to sessions where you might not do any prep, and you're just like, okay, today something is going to happen. I don't know what it is. Let's do this.
Yeah. Well, now you're speaking my language, because I wrote a little book called The No Prep Game Master. So,
yes.
Because I mean, when I was a teenager, sure, I could mess around and, and prepare things and write up stuff while I'm watching Star Trek or whatever. But now it's just, with a family and all kinds of other obligations. It's just, if I get 3 hours to game a week, I got 3 hours to game a week. I don't have, another 3 hours that week. And so I think, of course, sometimes I might forget a little bit that comes with experience, right? I've been running games now for years and years and years. And so that can be hard the first time you decide to run a game. It can be really hard.
Yeah. The first kind of near to full improv session you do, I imagine you're going to be an anxious, sweaty mess the entire time, worrying about whether you've made a terrible mistake and you should have just rescheduled the game so you could prep.
Yeah, yeah, and I always tell people, there are some kind of little tricks that you can do. Like if you get caught, kind of flat-footed on something, that's always the time when you say, "Okay, I need a bathroom break," or "I'm going to go grab a drink. I'm going to go grab some more snacks." And while you do that, you just think about it, and you give your
thing to do is to throw a binary choice in front of the players to say, if they kind of stumble, you just give them two options, because I find that they spend a lot longer talking about two options than they would about 10.
Like I said, I try to remember that, that it can take a lot of experience, to kind of go no prep, but I think that's where everybody should kind of lean into at least a little bit, every once in a while, because I just don't understand, how, you can spend, like I said, when I was a teenager, I would spend so much time prepping. It was ridiculous, but I do think that the no prep style can also make the game a lot more fun for the game master, because, I don't know what's going to happen either.
Exactly.
Right?
It adds an element of chaos to the game that can be really fun as the dungeon master, because you don't have all the answers. You just put the problems in front of the players and then trust they'll figure it out or they'll die.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, a lot of times it's, leaving things up to the dice, things up to a dice roll. You roll to see if you, hit the giant. You roll to see if you, can persuade the queen. Why not, if we have a few options, or I think of a few things, why not roll the dice and see if, just go with the one that you come up with randomly and see where that takes the session.
Exactly. Always go with the spice.
What would be some of your advice for somebody who's like beginning a new campaign, and they're going to, and they've already talked to their players and stuff like this, but they're thinking of some ideas. Do you have any advice for like kind of kicking something off and making it start with a bang?
So there's kind of two approaches you can take if you're a brand new DM and you're wanting to get started. You can either go really small and start from a kind of microcosm, take a town or even just a small area of a town and say, right, this is where this first adventure is going to be, and build out. Or you can go completely opposite direction and build a large and extensive world before putting your players into it. And which way you go will depend on the type of person you are. If you're the type of person that just enjoys world building for the sake of world building, then you probably would enjoy building a wide world. But if you are someone who isn't particularly fussed about world building or doesn't have a lot of time, only prep the things that you absolutely need. You need a couple of NPCs, a location, and a hook, and then just let the rest be down to the players.
Yeah, and what are some of your thoughts on world building if somebody wants to add a little bit more detail before they're starting?
I've got a lot of thoughts on world building.
Oh, awesome.
So my approach to starting a new game is I'm very much a world builder at heart. So for the game I'm currently running, we've been going now for about 25 sessions. But I spent probably a year off and on kind of building out the world, mostly for videos for my YouTube channel. But I spent a long time before we ever started thinking about the world, building out the map, figuring out what the Pantheon was and who the people were and all of these cultural things, to the point that now I very rarely need to do a huge amount of prep. I can just throw the players into almost any point on my map and go, here you are, you're in this area, what do you want to do? And I know enough about the surrounding world to be able to improvise my way through the session.
Now, when you created like even the Pantheon and all of that, did you work with your players to create the world, or is this you by yourself?
So it starts off, I usually start by myself and then slowly introduce them once I've got kind of a fundamental understanding of the world. So with the Pantheon's a great example. I started with a selection of deities, and then in the last campaign we played, one of the characters, their kind of main motivation was to join the Pantheon and become the goddess of time. So as I was developing the Pantheon for this new game, I approached the player and I was like, look, there is an opportunity here. We can put your character in as part of the Pantheon so that now you're adventuring in this different part of the world a few hundred years later than our last campaign, but you will see people giving worship to your previous character. And that's a nice way to kind of pay off that character moment from the first campaign that we played together.
So now, I mean, obviously working out of the Pantheon and all of that, I mean, you're going into some really great details here. So what would be, like, say, like a good starting point if somebody hasn't, maybe they've been running games for a while, or maybe they use Forgotten Realms or something like that, but they're wanting to start. Where did you start kind of building the world?
When you want to get started building your own world and it's your very first time, you want to think about the elements of history and the real world that interest you the most. For most people, there will be either a region of the real world or a time or a peoples who really kind of captivate your imagination. And I think starting with that as kind of your baseline is a really good way to go about it. So my current campaign takes place in the realm of Ashk, and it's kind of an amalgamation of ancient Egypt and areas of the Middle East and sections of the Mediterranean, all in this kind of melting pot of cultures that took bits and pieces from all these parts of history that I enjoy or am interested in. And I thought, right now, I'll take the pharaohs and what do I think is interesting about them. I'll incorporate that into the world, and then I'll take something else from over here and pull that in. And how do those two things that play off each other in my world, and kind of build it piece by piece. And every little piece you add will kind of affect everything else around it.
Do you write all of this down? Do you have like a huge book?
I don't have a huge book, but I do it all digitally. I'm very much a digital-based person. And so I do have kind of an extensive library of information of all the different things and all the elements of the world, which comes in really handy when the players kind of go off script and go in a direction I wasn't expecting. I've got all of this kind of lore to back up the improvisation I do. So they might meet a character who belongs to a certain group of people, and I know nothing about that character, but I know enough about that group of people to role play their mannerisms and their personality convincing enough that the players don't realize that I am laying the tracks in front of the train.
That's wild that you have so much material on your world. I think that's really cool. Now, when you start, how do you ensure that there are adventure hooks right there available for the right there at the beginning of the campaign?
So the way I approached it with this campaign is I kind of messaged all of the players and I said to them, here is a brief overview of the world. Have a look through the couple of sentences I've written for some of the major locations. See if any of those locations particularly spark your interest. And if they do, that's where we'll start the campaign. Otherwise, I have this kind of predetermined plot hook that can be a reason that you all got together. And we can play through that particular plot hook, then you'll kind of graduate into the open world and you can go anywhere and do anything. But if you as a group can't think of something to do as a first adventure between yourselves, I've got this one or two options ready to go that you can kind of ease yourself in with.
And so then once your players are in there, it's a sandbox world, right?
Oh yeah, it's about as sandbox as I could possibly make it. It's very much a world in which they really could just go anywhere and do anything. And in the last couple months, they have kind of exercised that power. They were in the middle of a whole bunch of quests in a city, and they just decided, no, we're done with this city. We're going to abandon all of our quests and leave. And that was absolutely fine because I know enough about the surrounding region and enough about the world to go, right, okay, you leave. So where are you going?
And I find that interesting because I've had a similar situation where, it was years ago, but it was, the group is in a city and we're doing all this stuff. And then all of a sudden the group is just like, you know what? We're tired of cities. Let's go out into the wilderness or whatever. And for me, being like a no prep game master, I'm like, well, I don't care if you're in the city or you're in the wilderness because I'm just making this up as we go along. So I'm glad to hear that you were kind of ready to go just wherever your players went.
Yeah. I mean, it's not an approach that I think will work for everyone, because certainly my approach does require a fairly heavy amount of prep kind of at the front of the campaign itself. You kind of need to do an amount of world building before you start the campaign. But then once you do start the campaign and you've got that world building in place, you don't have to do a huge amount of prep each session to kind of get things ready to be able to improvise your way through it, if that's something you are comfortable with.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about this, but I know there's a tendency sometimes for game masters or dungeon masters to kind of fall in love with certain storylines or certain NPCs. And then your players like stab them and walk away, or just turn, or don't interact with them. Like you do this big reveal and they're like, oh, that's nice. I'm not talking to her. And they walk away. How do you handle things like that?
So my approach is very much one of, if the players aren't looking at it, it doesn't exist. So with only a few exceptions, I don't really plan specific NPCs or specific locations to put in front of the players. If the players arrive in a new city, I will have a map of the city and I'll have a bunch of pins on it saying, oh, here is the tavern, here is a theatre. But there's no information for that tavern. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't have any patrons unless the players go there. And then when they arrive, I look at my list of tavern names and I choose a name. And it's now the Leaky Cauldron. And once they go in, I look at my list of NPC names and I go, right, okay, the bartender is named Tom. And those details exist kind of separate to the world until the players look at the thing they're interacting with, and then I fill in the information.
In my book, The No Prep Game Master, I talked about that because what I did for a while when I was quite a bit younger is I would create everything.
Yeah.
And then they wouldn't go anywhere near those things that
I've been there.
Yeah. Yeah. I know one time it was a Star Wars game. I created 12 star systems. And some of them had like 13, 14 planets. Some of them had gas giants with like 117 moons. Oof. I created tons of material for this. They went to 2 planets, not 2 star systems. They went to 2 planets.
We had in our last campaign, at the end of the campaign, I kind of produced an infographic saying, oh, here's how many monsters you fought, here's how long we played for, and it had a bunch of stats. And among the stats was the city they spent the most time in and kind of engaged with the most content in, and then the city that they spent the least time in, and then how many NPCs that they never met in that city. Just as a kind of acknowledgement of the fact that, hey, I'd done this work and you never saw it.
Oh, man. Oh, that is something else. I know. I think I drove myself crazy doing stuff like that. So that's one of the things that pushed me over into the edge of the no prep kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I know sometimes when, I used to create a lot of material, like I said, and it's becoming harder and harder as I've added more mouths to feed around my house and certain things. But what I like to do, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this because I've gotten some pushback on it, but sometimes what I like to do, since I like to run kind of in my own settings, and that is like, if we get around the table, I may give my players kind of a controlling idea, something that I'm kind of really interested in, like, I don't know, something that's just like off the wall, kind of like I see a movie or I read a book and I think, okay, we're going to take D&D and I want this kind of idea. I'm having a brain freeze of what I want in my, in my setting, but I want this one thing. I tell my players that, and then they'll make their characters and I'll try to work them, I'll give them some hints and stuff. But what I like to do is, sometimes even I've done it, we just sit around the table and I'll just ask my players questions about the world and take their answers and just kind of write them down and see, and kind of use some stuff that they create. Have you ever tried that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Wherever possible, I love to incorporate ideas from the players into world building, partially because it's so rare that you get players that are willing to like fully engage and make things for the world for you. But whenever I can, if a player comes to me and says, I was thinking that it would be really cool if I came from this icy region that had a huge chasm in the middle of it, I will say to them, absolutely, I will figure out where that is on the map, and it now exists, and tell me everything that you know about it. And that is how I kind of build out the world outside of the region that they're playing in. So at the moment, they're navigating their way through the nation of Ashk, but there's a couple of different countries that exist in the world because the players have said, right, I want to be from that country. And I will say to them, tell me what you know about this area, and I'll add it to the world map, and it will exist. And maybe in 2 campaigns' time, we will go there and we will set an adventure in that world that you helped to create.
And you just touched on something there. I don't know if it's a universal thing, but there's always seems to be 1 or 2 players that refuse to be from the actual gaming area, and they always want to be from a different continent or something. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I would love to know. It's thinking back on it, in pretty much all the games I've run, there's been a strong number of the players who have been from kind of out of the country. I think one reason might be it kind of gives them an in-character reason not to know all the things that their player doesn't know. If you come from the realm in which you're adventuring in, then you will have a degree of knowledge about that realm, or your character will have a degree of knowledge that you, the player, might not have. So you might come to a situation and the dungeon master will say, oh, Alfred, your character knows that this duke is the 3rd son of this noble king, or whatever it is. But the player doesn't know that. Whereas if you are a foreigner, then you're kind of on the same footing between the player and the character, and the DM can be like, all right, they can tell you about the world and not have that kind of narrative dissonance between character and player.
Over the years, I had run into this a number of times, but it wasn't until, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago when I started really listening to, RPG podcasts that people would mention the same thing. And there was, or listening to an actual play podcast, and there's always somebody who's from, who insists that they are from this other continent.
Yeah.
And I just found that interesting. But I do like your explanation there. And I wish, though, I could really determine what does that, or if it's, maybe I've grown cynical and I'm the bitter, old dungeon master or whatever. And it's just like, because they just want to throw a wrench into your into your planning or whatever. They're just like, no, I'm not from here, so I don't know any of this stuff. And
I'm sure that there'll be a small group of players for whom that is the case. But I find a good way to kind of turn the tables on that is be like, right, okay, you're from a different place. Tell me everything there is to know about that different place.
Yeah.
You don't want me to tell you about this place, so you tell me about the other place.
Yeah, no, and I think that is absolutely right. And again, this is kind of a theme of mine. It took me too long to realize that. Yeah, it's like, I don't have to create the continent they're from. All right, you're from a different continent or whatever. You tell me about it, and then we'll kind of run with that.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So we kind of talked about world building and stuff a lot. What about I know there's a lot of talk and stuff, about encounters. Well, what makes a really good encounter that will really engage players?
Oh, I think for me, the core kind of pillars of a great encounter are there needs to be clear, defined goals on each side. So what I mean by that is you need something more than just let's hit each other until we're dead. Both sides need to be accomplishing something, because if the only goal of an encounter for both sides is let's hit each other until we're dead, they could just go their separate ways and there would be no meaningful consequence to that. Whereas if the players need to get past this enemy so that they can storm the Black Fortress, or the enemies that they're fighting are desperately trying to defend the gate to said fortress, there is a goal there on either side that gives them kind of a narrative reason for it to be happening. And then once you've got a narrative kind of goal for your combat, you want to introduce as much variety as you can. So variety in unit types or monster types. So have some that are going to be up close and fighting, or some that are going to be long ranged and artillery, some that are going to use stealth and kind of ambusher tactics. Anything to make it so you've not got 4 skeletons stood in a line against the players and everyone just hits each other until they die.
Yeah. No, I think the idea of having a goal in the encounter is really good. And again, it's another thing I didn't learn for a while. But then too, you said adding variety. I think one thing that I did for a long time is, especially in D&D worlds, is I was like, okay, well, you're traveling. You have to travel someplace. Well, you're traveling through a forest. And then I was like, okay, the next time you have to travel, you're traveling through a forest. Yeah. And it took me a while to realize that, of course, they can travel through a desert or a swamp or marshland.
Yeah.
They don't always have to be in a forest.
Not only that, but even within a forest, you can have a lot of variety in kind of the terrain. So you can have sections of a forest that would be kind of a path or a road through it. So you've got open kind of regular terrain, or you could have like a dense thicket of underbrush where it's difficult terrain, or clearings or trees, just anything to make it so that it's not just a bunch of combatants in a square room that's completely empty. The further away from an empty square room you can get, in general, the more interesting a combat will become.
There are always just times when either I'm tired or something like that. I just, forget to even put in that there might be a large boulder next to the path through the forest or something like that, that somebody could get up on top of or something.
Yeah.
Just because I think sometimes, just kind of run out of ideas or something at some point, or or I haven't had enough caffeine or something that day.
Yeah, for sure.
You were also mentioning, that your campaign now has been going on for a while. Do you have any advice for kind of sustaining long campaigns?
Yes, I do. It will sound overly harsh, I fear, but I think that the key to success for a lot of long-term campaigns is going to come from kind of a steely determination on the part of the dungeon master. If you've got a group of 6 players and 2 of them don't attend, the game can still happen. But if the dungeon master doesn't attend, then there is no game. So to kind of drive that long-term campaign, you need to be driven as a dungeon master. You need to want to do it, and then you need to make sure that you're saying to the players, right, okay, we are going to play. If possible, set a dedicated day or a dedicated kind of date. Even if you can't play weekly, say right on the first Thursday of the month we get together and we play, and then make sure that as long as someone turns up, you actually play. Because I've found that if players don't attend for a week and miss something really cool, and they hear about it from the other players when they come back next week, it makes them more likely to start scheduling that time as being D&D night. So for my players, it's Wednesday night, and they know that if they're going to schedule something else, then they need to decide, right, okay, that is D&D night. That is when we play D&D. If I want to do something else that is on a Wednesday, I need to kind of weigh up whether I want to do it more than I want to play D&D.
No, I think that's great advice, and I love using kind of the pressure of hearing stories about awesome things that were done in the session they missed as pressure to get them to come back. I kind of like that.
It's been pretty successful for me. Another thing I do pretty frequently is I have the players recap the events of last session.
Yeah.
So I have them roll off for it every week, and the person that rolls the lowest has to do the recap, which kind of forces all of the players to make sure they're paying enough attention to what's going on, because they might be called up to do the recap the week after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's great. And that was another thing that it took me a little while to learn too. Yeah, because I was doing the recap for them, and I was realizing that they didn't have to do anything except for like bring a character sheet, and some of them wouldn't even do that. So so that took me a while to realize, get the players to tell you what happened, and then they're more engaged in it as well.
It's a good way as well to it's a good litmus test to figure out what they're engaging with, because if they're going to forget things, chances are they'll forget the things that didn't interest them or that they weren't compelled by. So it's a good way to you have your own notes and you kind of check them off against what the player's saying. And you kind of highlight the things that they miss and go, right, okay, they've missed that they spoke to this NPC. And then you can kind of think, well, why have they missed that off? Was it because there was nothing important going on with that conversation? Or was it that I didn't communicate things properly? Or you can kind of get a sense of what you consider to be important versus what they consider to be important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I absolutely agree. And I think that sometimes too, you can also read your players too, depending on their recaps. Just who is like really engaged in this campaign, and maybe that's the person that you want to, that their character is, going to take the spotlight a couple times, because they're just like super engaged.
Yeah, I think that most campaigns you end up with one or two players who are significantly more engaged than everyone else, and the other players tend to be kind of more audience members who are just along for the ride to roll some dice and kind of see the story that unfolds. And that's absolutely fine, but it's good to know which players are which, because then you can kind of tailor what you're doing to them. An audience member is probably going to be less affected by nuance and subtlety and more affected by big explosions or more overt things. So you can kind of tailor what you're doing at any one time to kind of draw in different players.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the engaged players too will respond to things outside, the D&D, kind of the cliche of D&D of hacking and slashing, right? You can present a moral quandary or something to your party, and if you have 2 or 3 really engaged players, that they will elevate the 2 or 3 that are a little bit more like, oh, I just want to hit stuff, or are we done yet, or something? Some of those people, one of my favorite things is to try and put moral quandaries in front of the players and to give them consequences. If I can make them question whether or not they're the bad guys, then I've done my job. Oh, wow. Could you give us an example maybe?
Oh, yes, I can. So in my last campaign, a lot of my examples are from the previous campaign because we're still fairly new in this campaign. But in our last campaign, the players needed to kind of stop the progress of an enemy army, and they knew that the only point that this army could cross a particular river was this one kind of bridge city. So they were like, this is where we're going to kind of make our stand and stop this army, and the way we're going to do it is by destroying the bridge. So at the time they had a genie with them, and this genie could carry insane loads. So their plan was to have the genie kind of pick up a huge boulder and basically fly it into space and then drop it on this city. But they didn't account for the fact that, dropping what is essentially an asteroid on a city is going to have pretty serious consequences. So they destroyed the bridge, but also wiped out half the city while they were doing it. So then for months afterwards, obviously the enemy faction had just painted them as terrorists, and they couldn't really refute it because they had done the thing they were being accused of. They just didn't realize it was going to happen when they did it. And they had to live with the consequences of that for the entire campaign. The NPCs they would meet would change their opinions on him when they learned that this is the group of people that destroyed Whitebridge, they would remember, the NPCs would remember that event and be like, no, actually, I don't want to deal with you.
Oh gosh, no, that's pretty good. That is an awesome kind of situation there. Although my first thought was like, that was an elaborate way to destroy a bridge.
Oh yeah, you'd think that they had carried barrels and barrels of TNT with them from a different location, because when they encountered this TNT, like the black powder barrels, they're like, we could use that to blow something up. Uh-huh. So they were still carrying these barrels when they decided to drop the rock. And then afterwards, they're like, you know what? We could have blown that up with the barrels. Yeah, you could have. You didn't know.
Oh my gosh, players.
They will always choose the worst possible option.
Yeah, I think so. Even when I play, I don't know what it is. Something's weird. There's some weird thing.
Your brain just gets infected by like chaos goblins, and if you're presented with two choices, you will just default to the worst one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just like, well, it's obvious we should just burn down this one thing, and you're just like, the game master's face is just like, oh. Okay.
Yeah. They've hired us to clear out the rats. There will be no rats if there is no building, because
we just burn down the inn. Rat problem solved. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but yeah, I think it is something with chaos goblins or something. I don't know, something. Yeah, when you switch chairs and you become a player, something happens.
Yeah. I think it's because they don't have as many pieces of the puzzle as we do as dungeon masters. Yeah. So they see every problem as something that can be exploded or stabbed, because they don't have necessarily all the context that we do. And then we don't understand why they're doing it, but it's just because they don't see half the puzzle. So they're like, I'm just going to stab it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is actually a very good point, because we could be sitting there and saying, well, blowing up that bridge is going to really affect how the people in that city react to your characters, let alone destroying half the city in the process. Yeah. Where they're just like, sometimes I think it is easy for players just to say, okay, blow up bridge.
Yeah. They see problem and solution, and they don't see anything beyond those two things.
Yeah. And then they realize, it's almost, I don't know if it's like a video game problem or something, right? Because in a video game, that's probably not going to be an issue, right? You just blow up the bridge. But in a tabletop role-playing game, it's just like, no, actually, this man comes and talks to you, and his whole family was killed when you drop that, that rock on there. How do you deal with him now? And you're just like, oh, right. This is a kind of a living, breathing world that the game master can create here.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of disparity between what a player expects from a video game and what they can do in a tabletop game is something that comes up quite a lot. I think that one thing I found with especially newer players is they expect me as the dungeon master. If I present something to them, they expect that I'm presenting them the option that I want them to take versus the option that they've happened upon. And quite often, with newer players especially, they tend to latch on to the first thing that comes up in front of them rather than looking around to see if there are other options.
That is kind of interesting there. You brought that up, because I think there is sometimes when certain players, I know I've done it when I'm a player, and I see it happen sometimes when I'm running, that there are certain players who are trying to figure out exactly what the dungeon master wants you to do.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, even little offhand comments, like something like, oh, you're really going to do that? Where I'm just, asking for a clarification.
Yeah.
Or something, they will be like, oh, he doesn't want us to do that.
Yeah.
There has to be another option.
I think that one thing that I've heard players kind of say a few times over the years is I've presented kind of a plot hook to them, and someone will say, well, that must be what we're meant to do.
Yeah.
And anytime that comes up, I always reaffirm that you're not meant to do anything. Your characters are who they are. If you want to pursue this plot hook, you can. If you want to leave town and go and start a wandering circus where monkeys ride on elephants, we will figure out how that is done.
Yeah, and I remember one time actually, I kind of really built up a campaign, and I said, "Hey, it's going to be a total sandbox." But in the first session, I was like, "Hey, it's a total sandbox, but here are 3 hooks, that are pretty, that like go along with some of your guys' backgrounds, and they're kind of just out there. But hey, it's a total sandbox." And so they pick one of the 3 hooks. And then kind of later on, they're like, well, it didn't feel like a sandbox. You wanted us to pick that one or whatever. And I was like, no, I said it was a sandbox.
Yeah.
And these are hints. These were hints just to get you started if you just were, confronted with a wide open world and didn't know where to go.
Exactly. I think that a lot of players think that they want a sandbox, but they actually want something that's much more on rails than they would otherwise admit.
Yeah.
I think when you kind of drop the players into the world and just say, right, okay, figure out what you want to do, most players tend to kind of spin their wheels and kind of get a level of stress because they have no idea what they can do or can't do or what they should be doing. Whereas if you give them a few options, then they feel more like they have the illusion of choice. We can go to any one of these 3 options. So we are making the choice, but we don't have to worry about there being 10,000 choices.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now, I mean, obviously you have a ton of advice here, but you've started putting some of this online, right? And making videos.
I have done, yes.
Yeah. Where can people find some of that stuff?
People can find me at Icarus Games on YouTube and just generally across the internet. If you search Icarus Games, you'll see my bearded face pop up.
And then, but you've also created some things, right? Too. You've created a war game, and you've been working on a lot of different things, right?
I have. I'm always making something. So before I got started, kind of making my business out of tabletop role-playing games, I ran a miniature war game company because obviously that is where my kind of love of tabletop started, was with miniature war games. So 5 years ago now, I started a miniatures company, started selling miniatures, making a game for it. And then over the years, due to various crises, I kind of put that on the back burner, and now I'm in full-on RPG mode. So I make the videos, and I do streams, and I come on podcasts and write stuff for Patreon, and just live and breathe RPG stuff now.
Okay. No, that's awesome. And I will make sure that I put links to Icarus Games and some of your other endeavors into the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening right now, just head over to the show notes and you'll be able to find Anto's work and his excellent videos on Dungeon Master advice. Well, Anto, I mean, the hour just kind of flew by. I could talk to somebody about role-playing games all day. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So, I thank you so much for the really good advice that you've given. I thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm always happy to come back. If you ever want to dive deep into more RPG and world building stuff, I'm always down to talk for that.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Anto today. He really gave some great advice that we can use when we are running games. And as I mentioned, I have linked up his YouTube and his social media in these show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, so you can check those out now. All right, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on here at Dice Geeks. Also, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I really could use your support on the podcast. Likes, ratings, subscriptions, all of that stuff helps the show out, and I appreciate every single one. And also, patreon.com/dicegeeks if you want to support the show financially. Now, guys, next Wednesday, I will have another great interview for you. So until then, keep gaming.